We would like to acknowledge that we're on unceded sovereign Gadigal lands. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, recognise their ongoing connections to the lands and waterways, and stand in solidarity with any call for truth, treaty and justice. Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Educative Evidence-Based Practices podcast.
Hello. As we go to air, it's likely, if you're seeing this near to the time, that people are writing their chapters and finishing up their first draft. So we thought we'd take a moment for Caitlin and me, Brad, hi, to just share our ponderings and questions.
Yeah.
And thinking about your own questions and ponderings, and perhaps, rather than answer them, you thought maybe you'd like to. We just keep coming back to the original source, Hoffman et al. Table of Contents.
I've been stuck on this page for quite a bit, mostly around the idea of pedagogical reasoning and I guess seeing if there's anything helpful in the way clinical reasoning could be applied to pedagogical reasoning.
So looking at number 2, information needs, asking questions and some basics of research studies. We've been talking about what are the information needs, and so in health professions versus education we have different information needs, and we've talked in previous podcasts about that idea of educative evidence-based practice actually informed by the medical model actually starts with the practitioner having a question.
Yes, and we've been talking a lot about what counts as a question or what types of questions could be helped by using this framework, whether it's a seemingly smaller question versus those bigger picture questions. And maybe those smaller questions still have a place and open up more questions as you go. Maybe why is the student doing this thing? Maybe that comes back to space, which comes back to pedagogy, really thinking about what types of questions.
What types of questions? And I think as we get into the contents, we can see that the medical model has got some help for us as well. And then interrogating this idea of, usually when we talk about evidence-based practice, people focus on the evidence. Whose evidence, what counts as evidence, and who gets to decide. And so we've been prompting ourselves to just apply that pause, wait a second. So if we do that here, information needs, whose information needs? And so there are lots of agents in the classroom, right? And I think the whole idea of coming to school is that you have an information need as a student, right? You have physical and just general education, how to be a person, a citizen, etc. So the students have information needs about musicking and about being cared-for and being cared for, etc., right? How to be in community, and the teacher has pedagogical and musical information needs as well. Hoffman et al. Give us some tips in chapter 2 about how to turn an information need into a pedagogical question. But they're talking to the healthcare professional. We've been talking to teachers, but I think just broadening that idea of who's asking the questions, who has the information need, and who has the questions, and where do you go for the answers? So we want to dig into that a little bit today. And then finding the evidence. Where do you go? In Australia, I don't think we're doing much work on how to help teachers
Find evidence and translate evidence.
So we're back to what?
Back to what is.
Yeah. So if we could nail down what is evidence, how do you find it? And I think some of the early chapters that we're getting in, which are really interrogating this idea of evidence, opens up the whole idea of where you would go to find the evidence, because there's evidence everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they've got these points about evidence about, and evidence about. So we look at chapter 4, 6, and 8. And when we were talking the other day, we thought, oh, that's really interesting. The idea is there's evidence about interventions and then questions about interventions, evidence about diagnosis, questions about diagnosis, prognosis, and questions. We've been wondering in education, what are our evidences and what are our questions? And I think something that Hoffman et al. Do really well is they try to point practitioners to the kinds of evidence you might go to ask the 3 different kinds of questions and 3 different places to look for answers.
Yep.
Which I think broadens from where we started this whole project of randomised controlled trials. And that's where you go to those. But actually the government's already gone to those. And so we don't have to go to those. So because we don't have a question, we just have the government's gone to the RCTs, and this is what works best. So this is expanding, I think, even if it doesn't expand all the way and comes from a prognosis intervention thing. It's pluralized evidence. There are evidences, and there are different kinds of things that practitioners are doing: intervene, diagnose, and prognose.
And different kinds of evidences for different kinds of questions. And even here, moving to chapter 10 and 11, they are looking at qualitative and quantitative.
So I think they're saying that you don't go to quantitative for a qualitative answer, which just expands the possibilities and what counts as evidence. So when we go to the OG model isn't what we've been presented with in education. So health professionals are expanding just as we're contracting. Then the thing that we found really interesting then was shared decision making.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool? Then there's our clinical reasoning from which we get
pedagogical reasoning.
Hooray. And educative evidence-based practices.
And I think coming back to that educative core has been quite important in our conversations recently as well.
And then I think embedding educative evidence-based practices into routine.
Practice care.
Yeah. But I love that it's got care in there.
Yeah.
Because we care. Yeah. Care, growth, and positive transformation. Okay, so maybe as people are working on their chapters, getting that first draft going, this is what we've been thinking about, and that's just the table of contents. So it turns out if you actually get into the book, you find out what the actual chapters 10 and 11 are. And there's lots more about how to turn your information need into a question and what types of evidences might be the place to look for the types of answers about pedagogical questions. So that's one thing. And then something else that Emily Wilson, one of our editorial team, picked up in her research for one of the podcasts was this article. And it exists in this 2019 version. And it's a chapter in our book. And I think they're the same thing, but just published recently.
Okay.
And I think it's really helpful because in my thesis, I was just really excited to translate clinical reasoning to pedagogical reasoning and what that might mean. But I didn't do much work on it. And so there's heaps of work to be done, which is why it's good that we've got 2 books. But I think we're up to book 5 in our planning by the time we get through all of this. So not much to say other than somebody else has written about pedagogical reasoning.
Yeah, lots in it if you're wanting to explore a bit more what that can mean.
Yes, which we do. And we would love you to.
Yeah.
That would be really helpful because it's a big deal.
Yeah.
What is pedagogy and what is reasoning? And how do you do it? Yep, plenty of work to be done there. All right, so there's that. And then speaking of reasoning, just going back to educative evidence-based practices, which thanks to Pam Bernard, we pluralized because there's lots of ways of practicing, involve using pedagogical reasoning to integrate information. So integrate information from 4 sources, and that's our 4 circles, to ensure that care, growth, and positive transformation of students as persons are at the center, which is why we've put care, growth, and positive transformation at the center of our framework of every teaching learning situation.
And we've been talking about, for us, teaching learning situations being musical episodes or musical sessions.
And these are all ways for us to think differently about what goes on in a so-called music classroom.
Or a studio.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
A musicking space.
Yeah.
Speaking of pedagogical reasoning, we've been reasoning with the gaps, the spaces between the circles or the 4 sources of information. And just wanted to just tell you about, actually. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I think so early on, I was quite interested in the space between and the relationships between the student and the teacher sources. But since then, we've been speaking more about all of kind of the other overlaps and also kind of the direction of the pedagogical reasoning. So whether that be like, even though evidence is in the title, it's not necessarily starting from the research evidence. So it's starting with that question, and then that might take you to thinking about or considering the context and then what research is related to that context and how that relates to then the values of the students. Or so thinking direction wise what that might mean and exploring those different kinds of possibilities and what that actually means. Is that a helpful kind of tool for pedagogical reasoning?
And so thinking about pluralizing pedagogy or expanding the notion or the idea of pedagogy, that changes the relationship between what's going on with that source of information and the others. And then this idea of how important practice, the practice context is, and what that actually means. In the medical model, that tends to be where the clinic sits, or where the clinical practice sits within a community, and the affordances of the clinical space, but also the community that space, that physical space sits in. And then also this idea of what is the knowledge and who has it, and this notion of knower and knowers, teacher as all-knowing and the empty vessels, versus students as knowers. And that's something that's coming through in some of the early chapters from other authors as well that we've talked about, which is why we've put the disciplinary expertise of each student, but also the pedagogical expertise of the students, or the learnership of each student and their ability to construct their own learning, right? So I guess this slide is just to share with you that we've been interrogating these outer spaces with double-sided, but we've also started to get into these inner spaces as well, and the affordances of the framework, and particularly this overlap at the bottom there between the research evidence, the practice context, and the values, preferences, and circumstances, essentially the student circle. So the research, the context, and the students, and that is independent of the teacher as well.
And I think we've put arrows on those overlapping outer circles or sources, but also kind of considering how they can be inextricably linked as well. So there's not necessarily a direction moving between them, but thinking about pedagogical expertise and its relationship to research, which can include philosophy. So yeah, there's just kind of a few different ways to think about that.
Yep, evidences.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think what we're trying to do with those arrows is just direct our attention to that space, aren't we? It's not really about that and that. It's just that space in the middle. And it's information as well. So those circles, rather than, I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear from people about, I keep trying to remind myself that's not people, it's information, but maybe it's helpful to think about there's a teacher over there and there are students over there. And there are ecological models and frameworks of this too, that put the whole thing within.
Nested. Yeah.
This was just one way, and I think maybe as we draw to a close, the original goal of EBP was to subvert the dominant idea of evidence-based practice in education, being there is evidence that tells the teacher, usually with the government and principals as intermediary, there's evidence, bosses read it, and that tells the teachers what works best. So that initial idea of just having other sources of information was our first move. And now as we've opened it up to the community, there's lots of other moves.
Yeah.
Isn't there? Hence how many arrows and triangles there are on the framework. So that's our questions and ponderings.
We're thinking about translation from the medical model, the types of questions we can ask, the types or whose information and whose evidence in that whole process of translation. What does that mean? We talked about pedagogical reasoning.
And going back, just as I found the original circles and the idea of reasoning to be really liberating, continuing to go back to the circles to see what other new and exciting affordances they might have for us to think differently and get outside the box, maybe into the circles of educative evidence-based practices.
Yeah. Yay.